Back. We're going to look at doing some basic retouching for portraits and looking at certain tools and brushes to eliminate small blemishes in someone's skin. But before we do that, we need to look at the color space that we're working in. And we need to double check this when we start to work with Photoshop files. So I'm going to go up into my main menu at the top of my screen, and I'm going to select Edit and come down to Color Settings. And then this window opens up. And these are my color settings. So if we look here at working spaces, we can see some parameters that we need to set. If we look at RGB, this relates to the color space that we're working in. So remembering an earlier video where I mentioned to set your camera at Adobe RGB, you should also set your Photoshop at Adobe RGB and your Adobe Camera Raw at Adobe RGB. This ensures that from the time you take the picture to the time we do an edit in Photoshop, that all of those images are working through a workflow where the color space is the same. We don't want to convert and reconvert an image into a different color space. Now sRGB is a smaller color space than Adobe RGB, so I'm going to come into this menu and select Adobe RGB. And I would leave these as is. Color management policies, have all of these checked off as at preserve embedded profiles. And then profile mismatches, select ask when opening. This will ensure that Photoshop will let you know if you're working with a photograph with a different color space or a different color profile, and it will either ask you to convert that profile or leave it the same. And conversion options, make sure the engine is Adobe, and the rendering intent is relative color metric. So going back to profile mismatches, if we go to open a file and we're not working in Adobe RGB, or that file that we're opening is not an Adobe RGB file, Photoshop will let us know, and it will ask us to convert that file to that working space. So make sure that all of your devices, your camera, Adobe Camera Raw, or Lightroom if you're a Lightroom user, and the color settings in Photoshop are all set to Adobe RGB. So basically every time you open an image, it's using the same color space, which is Adobe RGB. And once that's set, we can just hit the OK button.